pleasure to see you, Rob, although obviously we would have preferred to really have you here as one of the fellows of the Leibniz Science Campus, but we are optimistic that next year you will be able to come and so we can meet, and our students, our doctoral students can meet with you in person, which always is a great experience. We will also have to do today without the obligatory beer after your talk, or we can have it Zoom. We have to find a way how we can have a beer through Zoom. Maybe they're figuring out that as well. It's really a pleasure to welcome Robert Austin to this talk. Rob is a long-standing, not only partner of the Leibniz Institute of East and Southeast European Studies and also of the Science Campus, but he's also a friend of mine, so it's a double pleasure for me. Rob is Associate Director of the Center for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Monk School at the University of Toronto, and he is also professor at the center. Rob Austin is mainly a specialist of Southeastern Europe, and I think he brings together two very interesting trajectories. One is the trajectory or the experience of being a journalist working in the region and writing about Southeastern Europe in the 1990s, especially writing, for example, for the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, that is leading Canadian newspapers, but obviously Rob is also an historian, and he brings together the curiosity and the insights of a journalist and the analytical rigor and vigor of a historian. Robert Austin has a PhD from the University of Toronto, and he is also author of a really important and very useful book on the history of the Balkans in the 20th century, or actually since 1878. I want to show this. Okay, this is what the Zoom has not figured out, how to show pictures in the right way. It's making and remaking the Balkans, nations and states since 1878, which I really recommend because it's not only entertaining, but it really provides a lot of insight into the complexities and also ambiguities of state building in the Balkans, which is very much an ongoing and everlasting, as it seems, project. Another book that I should mention is his really excellent study of the early history of independent Albania under the title "Founding a Balkan State: Albania's Experiment with Democracy in 1920 to 1925," that came out in 2012. And I think Albania is one of the countries where Rob can claim particular expertise. Is one of very few people in this world, but he knows a lot not only about Albania, but about the whole of the region. And today he's going to speak about Hungary, which I think is also one of the fields of study that you want to build up, or that you build up at your center in Toronto. So thanks again for agreeing to hold this talk, which is early morning for you, but a nice afternoon post-supper talk for us, and we are all really looking forward.
Again, I'm always perplexed about where to look on the screen, so forgive me if sometimes I appear not to be looking at all of you. Bit of a shame not to be in Regensburg, as we established. I hope to be there next year. Who knows? We'll maybe pop in the fall to say hello. Would be nice. I remain kind of optimistic, even though every prediction I've made in the past 3 months has proven to be horribly wrong. But I think most of us could make that claim. Things have certainly not gone the way I headed. For example, this talk was based on something I was planning to do, because I still look at my calendar and say, okay, where should I be today? You know, today I should be in Regensburg, but next week I was supposed to be covering this Trianon memorial unveiling, which is taking place on June 4th to mark 100 years since the Treaty of Trianon. So I should have been in Budapest next week, but that's off. But this talk was kind of hinged to a degree about thinking about, you know, how these past 100 years have shaped Hungary and the type of new narratives. As Wolf said, I don't consider myself particularly as an expert on Hungary. So for some of you, you might find this talk not terribly innovative. It will probably appear more like a survey in some sense of the past 10 years, because Orban and the Fidesz party has been in power now for a decade. And I think what's happened in that decade in Hungary is breathtaking. I think some good things have happened. I don't like to always throw the baby out with the bathwater, but by and large, I judge the past 10 years as somewhat dangerous. And not just for Hungary, but for Central Europe more generally. Paul suggested I talk for about 40 minutes. Someone keep an eye on the time. I'm a fanatic about teaching my students to speak to the time limit, so I don't want to go on too long. So again, just in terms of an introduction, I'm going to just look at this past decade and then try to offer some conclusions about where we're headed and what this means, not just for Hungary, but also for Central Europe more specifically, but also more generally for the European Union. And having said that, the situation now with this COVID crisis makes everything so fluid that it's impossible to even discuss what the impact will be of COVID, for example, on the Hungarian project. So the first slide, of course, is that, to acknowledge that 2010 is the year in Hungary now. That's what Orban referred to as the revolution at the polls, where they overturned the system completely and began this notion that 1989, and Hungary is not the only country to pursue that logic, that 1989 is a sham, that 1989 is almost looks like a coup, in fact. Like you could, in their logic, 1989 is not so dissimilar from what happened, say, in Bucharest in 1989 and then 1990. I took that quote from the Constitution because that's an important part of the conversation. That the new fundamental law established this twofold revolution that was to take place in Hungary, that was to put Hungary back on a track that, to be frank, restored dignity. At least that's how they framed it, and restored some degree of national pride after what had happened under basically 8 years of socialist rule that preceded it, right? And here's my kind of paving the road to authoritarianism, this kind of how-to guide, right? There's so many things, everybody, you can say about what's happened in these past 10 years that it's hard to decide just what you put there. But Hungary is, and it's undeniable. And I used to be kind of one of those defenders, kind of saying, it's not so bad. There's some things we need to understand. But I've kind of given up on that and moving closer to most of my colleagues. And Hungary is definitely on the track to, a very limited form of democracy, if any at all. And my parallel for Hungary is basically the Horthy era, right? Because the Horthy era, and Wolf knows I'm an interwar specialist. Ultimately, that's where I do most of my studies. The Horthy era had all those same trappings, right, that you see in contemporary Hungary. It wasn't totally undemocratic. It had its opposition parties, but it had a central figure who presided over a kind of faux democracy, which was, of course, Admiral Horthy, and now you have Viktor Orban in the same place. So just some of these things that have happened, the fundamental law, which is this constitution, a fascinating read, very short, called the iPad Constitution, written on a train, I think, if I recall, in a very short period of time, amended multiple times. Then, of course, the media law, which transformed the Hungarian media landscape in really extraordinary ways. We saw this massive changes to the Constitutional Court, like these real attacks on institutions, which we saw the reduced retirement age, which was kind of clever, like we want to get rid of these people, so we reduced the retirement age to 62, and then everyone gets fired. The revisionism of history for me is the most kind of important. I've never been able to quite figure out how much that means to ordinary people, like all these questions about monuments, museums, like, how much impact does that have? But this is the triumph of what we call the Terror House narrative, which I'm going to come to later. And the government does draw a lot of legitimacy from history and a revision of history. So that's why I like to suggest that the period they're going to is, of course, the Horthy era. And when you talk to Hungarian government representatives, and I've had numbers of conversations, more were to take place this summer as part of my research. But Horthy, to say Horthy's partially rehabilitated isn't true. Horthy is totally rehabilitated. And the Horthy era is the go-to period. So in front of the parliament, for example, that's redone, like that's the parliament as it existed, I guess, in 43 or 44, right? The redoing of monuments, as I say there. The next point I've already given you, which is that throw out 1989, total waste of time. It only allowed socialists, communists to become socialists and, of course, engage in state capture. And by the way, not all of that is untrue. You know, the transition from communist to socialist to government, and if you look at some of the credentials of some of the people who ran the Socialist Party afterwards, particularly Ferenc Gyurcsány or Peter Medvesy, you look at their background, you know, Orban had something there. I'm always reminded that, I remember, you know, most of you have read this speech that Orban, when he appeared as a figure in 1989, where he was stood at the grave when they were reburying Imre Nagy and the other top leaders of the 1956 revolution. Like, people always said Orban was the front and center at saying, you know, we want Soviet troops out of Hungary. And that was kind of the thing that people latched onto. But when I look at Orban's speech in 89, I don't focus as much on that. What I think that he said most interesting, and I'm sure everyone in the audience knows, was where he called out the socialists for their crocodile tears. He was really hard. If you read it, like, he was kind of turning and looking at them saying, you guys make me sick. Like, here you are reburying the guy you murdered, and you're acting like you're sad about it. But it was your regime that killed him. So Orban's anti-communism was always way more important than any notion of liberalism. And I also think that to kind of, the way the media does it too, which is to paint Orban as a guy who lost faith with liberalism, and I'm going to come to that more later on, is kind of misplaced, because I don't see Orban ever as a liberal. You know, his party, Fidesz, was already on the nationalist right or sovereigntist right by 1995. And certainly that's how he campaigned in 98. So this, and that comes true in more, you know, better written academic books. But this notion of Orban, you know, goes to Oxford, he's a Sorosite, you know, all this other stuff, that's all overstated to create something that suggests an alternative turn of events for Orban. But I find a degree of consistency in Orban. I'll talk more about this. His system of national cooperation, which is the government's policy. There's a terrific book out now by Balázs Terencsény, our colleague at CU, and János Kovács, who used to be at the IWN in Vienna. I urge you to read it. It's really good. This is something that's part of this process. Conspiracy theories are really part of this government, a lot of falsehoods, and plus the maintenance of a permanent crisis. This is really integral to the government. And this, by the way, this last line is actually from Balázs and Kovács, which is, you know, he is a mastermind, Orban. I've never seen a guy control a party with that level of discipline, all right? Because don't forget, he was in the political wilderness for 8 years, and nobody tried to remove him. You look at the upper echelons of Fidesz, it's really tight. And he's managed to create a party that has not been beset by these kind of cleavages. So first he controlled the party, which he did. Then he controlled the state, and now he controls what is ultimately, to me, a party state. A la, not necessarily Horthy, but certainly a la the other go-to model, which is János Kádár, okay? With goulash communism, which becomes goulash authoritarianism or whatever. Quick survey of what's good, right? And don't, pre-COVID, we don't know, because these guys in Hungary, as you know, they're pretty dependent on the German supply chains. And the car industry is really integral to Hungary's success. But high economic growth, incredibly low unemployment. Hungarian workers got shafted a bit, some changes in the labor laws, but at the same time, they've been negotiating contracts that are really the envy of lots of other workers, particularly in North America. It's an extremely low tax environment. From Canadian standards, everybody, oh my God, because my tax is well over 45% right now. These guys are at flat tax at something like 12%. Compensated by this, I believe it's the highest VAT in the EU. The only thing close, I think, would be Greece. The other thing, Hungary, for a small country, like, it's incredible how much influence Hungary has. There's 10 million people, but Orban has allowed it to exert influence that is really quite telling. And keep in mind that along with the Chancellor of Germany, he's been there the longest. Now it's 10 years. And his influence within European policy circles, within particularly the European People's Party, is really, really important. The system he created, at least perceived by the population, is a strong economic management. when I talk to people who are not Fideszites, who still vote for Fidesz, the tendency is like, we don't trust the opposition to manage the economy. Orban has been largely credited, even by the people who don't like the let's say, the illiberal aspects of it, for economic management. The opposition has never kind of projected an image of solid economic management. So like the 1960s and 70s, there's an existential security from threats that he created for you, by the way, right, which are migrants. You know, so the existential security is from migrants, which we're currently in danger anyway. So you no need for politics. So it becomes a kind of Kadarism redux, which is the population is really tuned out. They've got their more or less what they need, and the government protects them from these various dangers. This is lost all the time, I think, and especially in media coverage. Hungarians are pro-EU. Like, that's full stop. Particularly young people. Like, Orban questions Brussels, but not the EU. He's not a lunatic, right? His language is Brussels. The EU, you look at any polls, especially 18 to 24, the support for membership in the EU is extremely high, and people recognize that the EU's been a net benefit. Hungary's been a net benefactor from European Union enlargement. So to suggest this kind of Euroscepticism isn't really true. And that's a red line he doesn't cross. Again, he's very strategic. So he doesn't push the criticism to the EU. He shifts it. It's always Brussels, Brussels, Brussels. And the last thing I want to point out, I put an asterisk there. The good news is that, and I don't know how many of you have read, I've got it here, Ivan's new book, The Light with Ivan and Holmes. I enjoyed this because Krastev can be pretty funny, and same with Holmes. But the beauty of the Hungarian story is, I stand by this. The Hungarians think they can transform Europe. Like, they're at such a hubris level that their net sovereigntist version of the future is going to prevail. I just don't buy that. I think a good historian should know that what happens in Hungary is never going to shape the fate of Europe. So I don't think we need to fret too much about this idea that fish maybe doesn't rot from the head. Like, maybe it rots from the periphery. I haven't got the faintest idea. But the Hungarian project, I don't think, is that dangerous. It's dangerous for Hungary, but I don't see it as something that's going to destroy the European Union. And moreover, especially when you compare it to Poland, like, Poland hasn't gone near as far in its clampdown of civil society and liberalism as Hungary has, particularly when you look at the role of regional governments, et cetera. So the Hungarian model, I think, is kind of limited to the Hungarian model. And I don't give it a huge lifespan either. This terms, like, I just threw this in because I thought it was funny. I was doing all these readings. Like, my political science colleagues think that inventing a term for something is like equivalent to curing cancer, right? It's not. But these are some of the names. So autocracy, liberal autocracy, post-communist mafia state, soft fascism, neo-communism, tribalism, blah, blah, blah. These are some of the things that it's called. These are some of the ones I put in: Ortheism, Kadarism, goulash communism, Frankenstate. But my last point is that definitely this project is totally improvised. And by the way, everybody, that's like, I shortened the list. There was way more names I could have going through these readings. I'm going to continue to work on that for states to describe what is going on in Hungary today. But again, coming back to my main point, which is that Hungary does not qualify as a democracy anymore. I don't think you can negotiate that. What it's going to become, again, if I choose one, I go with kind of soft authoritarianism because it seems to capture the essence of what's happening there. Okay, I just wanted to go over some of the elections quickly for everybody so that we could remind ourselves how well they've done. 2010 is their big victory. Remember, the Hungarian parliament used to be huge. That's one of the good things he did, is he cut the parliament in half almost by reducing the number of seats, because they used to have well over 300 seats, and now it's down to 199, which is reflecting better its population. But the one thing I want to stress is that people forget sometimes that just what a state Hungary was in 2010. The legacy of 2006 was already present. There was the 50th anniversary of the 56 revolution. Socialists were in power. There was a lot of violence already. There was, and that still resonated in 2010. Most importantly, and Krastev and Holmes stressed this a lot too, but they're not the first to do that. The impact of the financial crisis was really harsh on Hungary. And I find very little, especially in the media, very little emphasis on just how bad things were in Hungary in 2008, 2009. And how endangered vast majorities of the population were by impoverishment. the banks. So it wasn't dissimilar from the subprime crisis that hit the United States. Gratefully, it never hit Canada. We never had anything like that. But Hungarians were in extraordinary debt to particularly Swiss banks because they had floated these loans and et cetera. So Orban came into power and recalled the socialists, that speech where Gyurcsány had acknowledged that they had basically criminalized the state, that they had stolen the state, and that speech was, of course, released. It reveals that Hungary was at a precipice. So Orban's seizure of power in 2010 in a dramatic way was the result of extremely bad government for 8 years, which almost necessitated an intervention from the IMF, World Bank, and the EU that Greece had. And in fact, you could credit Orban to a degree with preventing that. So this gave him this mantra of solid economic management. He did that, of course, by nationalizing pensions, et cetera. There were some shady deals, but he did restore fiscal stability. The points they make about increasing tax collection are true. Reduction of unemployment is true, although that was a bit disingenuous because they ended unemployment insurance. So they went to this notion of workfare, which is part of the system of national cooperation already alluded to. But it began, again, everyone focuses on the political revolution, but there's another revolution, which is the fiscal side. And the fiscal side, again, is less covered, and it's still somewhat important. Okay, 2014, again, I just go through this quickly. Again, he cuts the number of seats by 187, which saves quite a bit of money, by the way. He wins again. Everyone's always complaining about how he rigs the elections, but he wins elections under multiple different systems, right? So you can't always just say, well, he rigs the elections, because in 2010, he won under the old system. In 2014, he won under a different system. And in 2018, he won under a different system. So he won biggest actually under the old system, which was 2010, which was the election system basically put in place by the governing socialists. He keeps supermajority, so it's mostly first past the post. The Jobbik party we can talk about later, which is the far right. But the one thing I want to stress is that in the Hungarian case, like when you look at the opposition, Orban didn't destroy the opposition. The opposition self-destructed. And it's not because he waged a financial war on them, which he did kind of later. But prior to that, the opposition parties in Hungary had already shown an incredible incapacity to counter the kind of narrative that he was pushing. And moreover, the presence of certain politicians who continued to be front and center. And I know Gyurcsány particularly, who had such a taint about him. The fact that he remained involved in politics, to me, is a little bit odd, to the point where even normal people could say that someone like Gyurcsány is a stooge of Orban, which of course isn't true, but you can see how people buy into these conspiracy theories. I want to come to this. This, for me, as a historian, now I'm going to talk about some of the different aspects of it that I think will be interesting for historians in the audience. This is from the Constitution, right, which is really controversial. I really emphasize this with my students because I find that students today can't really grasp how you can use history to advance an agenda, right? And this is particularly true in Canada, where these things are really remote from a student. When you live in a city that doesn't move monuments around, you know, the monument to the First World War doesn't disappear for a government and then come back or get melted down or something like that. There's a consistency here because we agree on our narrative. Basically, we have challenges regarding the native peoples that we try to cope with, but largely there's a consensus around the narrative in Canada, which isn't true in Hungary. So this thing I always was troubled with. It's the preamble from the Constitution, which sets this period of 44 March to May 1990, the first popular elections, as an occupation period. Very, very controversial, particularly as it relates to the discussion of the Holocaust. And this comes back to my mention of the notion of Horthy, as being the kind of symbol par excellence for the current government. And in a conversation with Zoltán Kovács, right, who is, some of you would know him, he's the spokesperson of the regime, and he's a very articulate guy. He's a graduate of CU, by the way, with 2 degrees, okay, 2. Not 1, but 2. And he says CU is a fake university. So there you go. I would never say that about my universities. But, you know, the logic that Horthy, as the guy who saved Hungary, is really the most important message the new government would issue. And he saved Hungary from Bolshevism, okay, and fascism eventually. But we can leave that for the Q&A period. This is Trianon. I think this is because this, I wanted to put in something about this because this is what I was going to study. Trianon is revised. It is already revised, virtually. Citizenship laws have been changed. Hungarians living in the neighboring countries can vote. By the way, interestingly, the Hungarians in neighboring countries get to vote by postal ballot, right, if they want. The Hungarians who live in Toronto don't get to vote by postal ballot. So he's created a system whereby the neighboring guys can get a vote in easier than potentially, you know, young liberal Hungarians living, let's say, in, I don't know, maybe in Germany for that matter. Trianon lives because it was buried for so long. I think it's not surprising that Trianon has a lifespan that is far longer than Versailles or Saint-Germain or whatever. But it is a tool for political manipulation for him. And I've already stressed this. The interwar period is their go-to period for legitimacy. So it's Horthy, and Horthy saved them. Horthy saved the Jews. Horthy saved Hungary. These are all the most important things. 1944, I mentioned that this is the recreation of this. And by the way, the recreation of the Parliament Plaza is breathtaking. I'm not denying that. It's absolutely fantastic. The 2020 monument, coming soon. It's being unveiled next week. I've only seen some drawings of it. If any of you are lucky enough to get there, and if you can travel to Hungary, it would be something to behold. I don't know exactly what kind of message. It is designed by, or the project is managed by, you know, the court historian, Schmidt-Maria, who, of course, did the Terror House and did this even more controversial exhibit about the end of the First World War in 1918. I don't know if any of you saw it. That's it. Just quickly, I don't know if you can see that. It just tells you that the Hungarians are the most prone people in Europe to think that neighboring territory belongs to them. Okay, so this is the point. Like Trianon lives, but you have 67% of Hungarians thinking that territory of neighboring countries. This is within NATO countries, by the way. And I'm not surprised, Wolf, you'll get a kick out of this. The Greeks are second. Okay. Third is Bulgaria. Okay, and then it drifts down, okay? Poland's still at 48, but this, again, this is an interesting statistic that tells you how much Trianon lives on in people's minds. This, of course, is the Terror House, which is part of this process. Remember, this was opened at the end of the first Fidesz government in 2002. It's a private museum, which means it can't be messed with, regardless of who's in power. That narrative is the one I gave you, which is that, and Wolf, Wolf and everybody, I don't know how many of you have read that book. Wolf, you'll have to unmute. The woman who wrote Red Star, Jelena Subotic, is that right? Yeah?
Jelena Subotic.
Yeah, it's something like Red Star, Red...
Yeah, and Holocaust memory, I think.
Yeah. Very little on Hungary there, everybody, but it's this, and it's common not just in Hungary, and we've seen it elsewhere, is this conflation of the communist experience with the war experience, with the Holocaust experience, of course, starting to take a little bit of a sideline. So the Terror House narrative is very much fundamental to the current government. The main thing is to draw that single thread from German occupation in March 1944 and the arrival of Adolf Eichmann in Hungary, through to the communist takeover with the Arrow Cross guys largely being communist shifting and the focus being, again, a general conflation. And the one thing I'll add about Terror House, for those, I've been there so many times, it's disgusting. And I don't want to go anymore. I used to take my students there. There's no mention of Jews in Terror House, okay? Because the Jews are, you know, as Schmidt-Maria said, like, that's the Holocaust Museum. This is not the same space, right? So they get this so-called House of Fates, which is not quite finished in Hungary, which is also another controversial thing. And I'm going to come to one other, okay? There's this monument, I'm sure you've seen, which the West went crazy about, right? Which is this German monument to German occupation, which is not so clear. But you can see the eagle on his talon there representing Germany. It says 1944. It's as ugly as all hell. It's one of the worst monuments I've ever seen. It's on front of a roadway. It's on this Freedom Square, which is a cornucopia of really weird messages. You know, so you have that monument, you've got the bust of Miklos Horthy not so far away, you've got a statue of Reagan, Ronald Reagan, you've got the Soviet Liberation Memorial, all in this crazy space. But this one was very controversial, put up at night, by the way, you know, to avoid protests. But it has an ongoing protest in front of it called the Counter Memorial that suggests there's another story here, because it was not set up with any kind of consensus. I'm perplexed about it, everybody. I don't know. I think people make too big a deal about it. It's ugly. It's factually inaccurate. But whenever I'm there, I never see any Hungarians there. You know, so who's it speaking to? I haven't got the faintest idea. This one is new, by the way. To the White Terror. Excuse me. Mistake, step back. Monument to the Red Terror, it says right there. So this was a monument that had been torn down by the communists, of course, post-48, and in a space near the parliament. But then Orban resurrected this Victims of the Red Terror monument. And it's back, and there's another story to this one. What I found interesting is when he unleashed it, when he launched it, he brought in you know, this cast of celebrities, but one of them was this representative of one of Hungary's Jewish communities, right? Because Orban has Jewish communities that support him and Jewish communities that don't. So he brought this guy, Rabbi Kovács, and Kovács, I thought it was so odd, and I'm writing about that, because Kovács was saying, you know, this is a very important monument. He said that, you know, the time of the Red Terror, which was when Bela Kun was in power in the summer of 1919 for 133 days, he said that was the one time Hungary gave up religion. This was the comment from Kovács, the rabbi and representative of this one community that's aligned with Orban, and how important it was to have the monument. But the story that wasn't told was that both the Red Terror and the White Terror that followed it targeted Jews. So it's a little bit of an odd statement for them, but again, it's part of this resurrection of the plaza near the parliament to represent 1944, before all these fiascos started. The last one I want to mention, because I do believe is interesting, is that Imre Nagy, which was put there by Canadians, by the way. That's a Canadian gift to Hungary after the collapse of communism. So the original Nagy Bridge is where the Red Terror monument used to be. So Imre Nagy had to be moved. And that was controversial, but the current government's perspective on Nagy isn't, you know, that favorable. For them, Nagy was, after all, just a communist. There's nothing. The current government celebrates 56 way more than the socialists. Like, their money spent on, but they celebrate the freedom-fighting aspect of it. The guys with the Kalashnikovs, the Budapest boys, you know, the kids with the grenades and the Molotov cocktails. So a guy like Nagy is irrelevant to them. So he got moved, and as you can see, he's there. He's now down the river further near the Margaret Bridge. But what's funny, you know, and it's kind of, because Hungarians have a great capacity for, here he's looking, the original statue, he's looking over his shoulder to the parliament. Now he's looking over his shoulder to the former headquarters of the Communist Party. You know, there's a cleverness to it. They still use it for MPs and stuff like that, but I think that's a temporary move, everybody. I do believe that eventually he'll get melted down and he'll become something else, but not 2015. And Paul, you keep an eye. I'll go for about 10 more minutes. Does that sound good? How am I doing for time? It's so hard to talk without a dialogue. You know, it's, for me, Wolf, it's impossible. I'm so used to having an audience where you can, you know, that's why this face-to-face thing is irreplaceable.
But I think another 10 minutes would be just fine.
Okay, terrific. Good. So Orban's Reborn in 2015. I can do this quickly. Like, Orban in 2015 was kind of finished. You know, the guy was looking like a weekend warrior, everybody. You know, there was no new ideas. So the refugee crisis becomes an incredible godsend for him, because it's out of the refugee crisis that Orban is totally recreated. And he finds this new space, this new political space, which he carves out of the crisis that Hungary endured. And the crisis was severe. You know, I was reading a comment by Anne Applebaum, and, you know, the government cannot stand her, obviously. But she said, you know, Hungary was never facing refugees. And she goes, sure, a few people did pass through Hungary. It wasn't a few. It was a lot. It was almost 1 million people. I was there in September 2015. But the crisis did blow over, but he turned the migrant crisis into a permanent political program. And he did that very successfully. Just quickly, you know, the referendum, I don't want to spend too much time on that. He began this process of these kind of ersatz or faux consultations with the population regarding issues. They were always really skewed and biased towards getting an answer. So they, you know, to get rid, you know, to dispense with refugees as an issue, they went to a referendum, which they won. But this was after a really aggressive poster campaign. And this also begins the Soros narrative, which we've all studied and talked about, which is the most ridiculous thing that Hungarians are expected to believe. And of course, many of them do believe it, right? I like this map because it shows you how much, this is their 2018 election. Like, this is orange, okay? Like, this is incredible. Their power outside the city of Budapest is incredible. And it's an extraordinary manipulation of rural media particularly, okay? The predominance of state TV or, you know, public TV, and I think Hungary doesn't have public TV like the way Canada has public TV. It has state TV, has manipulated so that they are in an unassailable position, and they can afford to lose periodically in cities like Budapest, etc. But this is where they stand right now, and this, it means that, you know, barring crazy things, that the Fidesz can govern perpetually. Here's a couple of my comments about the last elections. Not universally condemned, okay, imperfect, but doing things any differently than you see in an American election, not especially, okay, kind of standard. Again, Soros, attack on Soros, which resonated. The NGO sector resonated. Brussels resonated. The CU was a failed campaign for them because it didn't resonate. He had to, the CU thing, they destroyed CU. We could talk the whole next 2 hours about CU. They destroyed the Central European University, there's no doubt about it, but it didn't capture the minds of the people because they weren't so concerned about a small university. He ramped up the attack on Ukraine, which really resonated regarding that small Ukrainian community, Hungarian community in Ukraine. And again, the aggressive Hungarian nationalism, which has always been the case. It was the case in the 19th century. It was the case, the only time it wasn't aggressive was during the communist period because it had to be buried. But Hungarians are not acting that dissimilar than they were since 1867 and even preceding that. Here we are today. State of emergency was already declared in 2015. So it just gets extended. So Hungary is actually in a permanent state of emergency. And by doing that, it's actually deconstitutionalized the state. So you can't actually refer to Hungary anymore as a constitutional state. All the acts that have followed the Constitution in 2011, the various amendments, have kind of deconstitutionalized it. And moreover, it has no institutional structure anymore, other than the party state apparatus. And that comes back to the beginning slide, which is, you know, control the party, control the state, and then control the party state, right? I wanted to spend, we can talk about the thing, the one thing that's less covered recently is these massive changes in cultural policy are breathtaking too. It's unbelievable. We were there in December when there was so much going on, but what they've done first to the universities to grab control of universities. I work at a university where we're dependent on the government for money, at least part of it, but the independence level is so profound that it's sometimes hard for me to get it, but the universities are not functioning as independent institutions anymore, okay? And that's why CU not only was an independent institution, but it bugged Hungarians because it was the country's best university. Like, that really irked them. That irked them more than the Soros narrative probably, which is why, and then to create, I don't know if you know, but the universities were clamped down, and then they created a new called the National Public Service University, which, by the way, is like a Potemkin village. I've been there. Like, it's great things. You can go and ride a horse there if you want, right? It's fantastic. You know, the buildings are great, but you go in, it's like, wow, is this ever weird? Like, you got the best TVs, the best screens, the best tech, but I don't see any students. But this is the kind of party state university where the money's been thrown. The cultural policy came in December, centralization, heavy funding of traditional Hungarian things. So avant-garde, forget it. These are the really big changes that took place at the end of December for the artistic. 2020 rule by decree, which we have now, which he's suggesting he might lift soon. Pretty disingenuous, not really talking in an open way with the opposition about how the rule by decree could be implemented. Not surprisingly, not so much criticism of Hungary from the EU, the main EU actors, right? I wanted to throw this quote from Peter Sugar because I always thought he was a great historian. I'm sorry it's overly long, but I just want to say that I just don't see it as new, what's happening in Hungary. I don't look at it and go, oh, because I'm a historian. I think, well, I don't see anything that different. Again, I see Kadarism as different because Kadar couldn't pursue like aggressive nationalism because of the communist context. And he introduces social peace through consumerism. But I look at it as like, wow, your nationalism is not that different than it is than it has been in the past. This is my conclusion because I think I'm right on schedule. Holmes and Krastev, are they upset because they're tired of imitating? I don't know. There is something to that. I also believe that 1989 was a quest for normality, so that it isn't 1917 where you turn the apple cart upside down or the world upside down. That 1989 isn't, idea central. There's not so many good things. It's basically saying you have that, we want that, let's get that. I think more needs to be studied on the failure of decommunization. That's what I did mostly when I was working more on Albania. I find decommunization is a failure across the board, and I think it created some of this sentiment that leads to these situations. Because there's a truth to that the socialists were pirates and that they stole the state. That's for sure true in Bulgaria, right, Ulf? Like, you can't deny that. And it's true in Romania, and it's true to a degree in Hungary. Less true in Czech Republic. Security threats, yeah, they're illegitimate. The notion of Christianity is his thing. I think it's overstated. As I said before, it's not really a constitutional state any longer. It is an authoritarian state. But the last thing I want to mention is that the notion that bugs me the most when we're all looking about this is that liberalism failed. Liberalism was never in Hungary. It's never been there. So how can it fail? If liberalism existed in Hungary, it was for like 2 years. So let's say 90 to 92, or even stretch it to 94. But the notion of liberalism in Hungary, failing or dying, it doesn't resonate with me because I don't see any of these actors as fundamentally liberal. Particularly Orban, who's allegedly the best example of the guy who, goes to Oxford and says, I'm going to do this, and then comes back and decides that, sovereigntist nationalist projects are more rewarding. So that's basically it. I don't think I have anything more there. See, nothing more. And that should have been 40 minutes, right?